Good morning. Welcome to this joint overview and scrutiny committee. I am Councillor Mary McLaren and I am chairing the meeting today. However, as it is our first meeting in 2025, I would like to wish our committee and our guests a very happy new year, and a happy new year to anybody who might be joining us online. May I first remind you of some domestic arrangements. If you are attending the meeting to speak and persistently interrupt the meeting, you may be asked to leave. Please ensure your mobile phones and laptops are on silent. Additionally, we will be using e-voting for this meeting on the modern.gov app. However, in addition to that is that we will be voting on the minutes. We've got quite a few outstanding minutes. We will be voting by a show of hands. Okay. The council, members of the public and the press may record, film, photograph or broadcast this meeting when the public and the press are not lawfully excluded. If you are intending to do so, please inform the committee clerk. If you hear the fire alarm, leave the building immediately via a fire exit and make your way to the assembly point, which is Ipswich Town Football Ground. Follow the signs directing you to the fire exits at each end of the floor. Do not enter the atrium, which consists of the ground floor area and walkways. If you are in the atrium at the time of the alarm, follow the signs to the nearest fire exit. Use the stairs, not the lifts, and do not re-enter the building until told it is safe to do so. We have the following people in attendance this morning. We welcome Councillor Alistair McCraw, who is the Babergh Cabinet Member for Performance and Resilience. We have Sam Lake, Head of Customer Experience, James Hart, Complaints and Feedback Officer, and Sarah is at the back, who is the Director of Customer Services, so we welcome her as well. And of course, Alicia Norman is our lead officer for overview and scrutiny, and she will be supporting us through this meeting. I will go to the agenda. Apologies for absence and substitutions.
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies this morning from Councillor Ruth Hendry and Councillor Ross Piper. We have no substitutions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Item 2. To receive declarations of pecuniary, other registrable or non-registrable interests by members. Are there any to declare? No. Item 3, which is to confirm the minutes of the joint meeting held on the 14th of October 2024. Are there any points regarding the accuracy of the minutes? No. Could I have a proposer, please? Councillor Caston. And a seconder, please? Councillor Wyman. The lead officer will now ask for a show of hands.
Thank you, Chair. Members, could we have a show of hands for the minutes? Thank you, Chair. That's carried.
Thank you. So the minutes of the joint meeting of the 14th of October have been confirmed. Now, item 4. This is JOS 24/8 to confirm the minutes of the Babergh meeting held on the 16th of December 2024. This is an item for Babergh members only. Are there any points regarding the accuracy of the minutes? No. Could I have a proposer, please? Councillor Jameson. Seconder, Councillor Granton. Can I have a show of hands, please, from the Babergh members? So the minutes of the Babergh meeting on the 16th of December have been confirmed. We now go to item 5, which is JOS 24/9, to confirm the minutes of the Mid-Suffolk meeting held on the 19th of December 2024. This is an item for Mid-Suffolk members only. Can I ask if there are any points of accuracy? Councillor Scarf? No, sorry. So nobody questioning the accuracy of the minutes. Okay. A proposer, which is Councillor Scarf. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Rowe. Thank you. And a show of hands, please. The minutes of the Mid-Suffolk meeting on the 19th of December have been confirmed. Was that it? I thought there was another one.
That's it.
Hmm?
That's all.
That's it, is it? Okay. Well, it seemed a lot more than that, was it? Right. Item 6, to receive notification of petitions in accordance with the Council's petition scheme.
None received, Chair.
Item 7, questions by the public.
None received, Chair.
Questions 8, questions by councillors.
None received, Chair. Thank you.
So we now come to item 9, which is our main item of the meeting, which is JOS 24/10 Annual Complaints Report 2023-24. And I would like to invite Councillor Alistair McCraw to introduce this item to the committee. Thank you, Councillor McCraw.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, members. Thank you for coming today. I'm here to introduce this report very briefly, which is an overview of resident feedback from the year 23-24. There is always a time lag. Remind we're getting ready for 25-26. Does seem so. This is a longer report than in the past. It's required as part of the Housing Ombudsman's new complaints code. We amended that last year, and it includes the need for this performance to be reviewed by the Scrutiny Committee. It's an executive summary of the annual report, but you can find the full details, statistics and a narrative in the appendix. If I was to go and draw some highlights, and that's, I think, the basic points that I think you can draw from the report, well, things to note is we'll be producing the annual report again for 24-25, and you will see more information, particularly in areas regarding housing. The transformation work in the housing sector for the councils has started to see a decrease in complaints as well as an improvement in customer satisfaction levels. When we're here, we're looking at the past, and we look forward to reporting those in due course. We have, in fact, been doing so through the quarterly performance reviews that we publish on a regular basis. The key things I've noticed is that there's been press comment that there's a high level of complaints. Well, local government ombudsman always stresses that high levels of complaint should not be viewed as a negative. I've worked in customer service all my life, and complaints are needed because you need to know where things are wrong, because you can't fix them otherwise. You need to know what to do. We need people to be able to provide feedback, and accordingly we've made it much easier to do so. Unsurprisingly, we are receiving a higher number of complaints because people can find where to go quicker, and that actually helps us, and it helps us to help them. The new complaint system, as I say, carries on. We've only had one complaint for both councils upheld by the local government ombudsman last year, and 5 from the housing ombudsman. The housing services have a quarterly complaints task force, and we are learning lessons from those complaints. I don't want to go any further into detail. You can see the detail for yourselves. We'll be pleased to take any questions you have, and I recommend the report to you. It asks you, amongst the recommendations, to make your own suggestions to the portfolio holders, myself and Councillor Mellon. So obviously we'd be interested to hear of anything you have to suggest and see what we can do about acting upon those. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McCraw. We can start the questioning. Councillor Jameson.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few questions, but when a complaint is received, how often do we aim to update the complainant or progress?
I think I'll defer to Sam here.
Yep, thank you, Councillor, for the question. So when a complaint is received, there is an instant acknowledgement to give the complainant a reference number, and then there is a requirement to update the complainant within 5 working days of receiving the complaint to confirm the next steps, just to introduce themselves as the complaint investigator, and then the complaint should be closed within 10 working days. If more time is required at that 10 working days point or before, you need to let the resident know that you wish to extend the complaint and why. So at that point, they would also have another kind of update from us.
Oh, that's good. I mean, I used to work in customer relations, and that always was a big gripe if people were not getting updates on, and that could turn a disgruntled customer into a really unhappy customer, or vice versa if they were. So they are getting. But also, I noticed that with complaints increasing, you say they're increasing, they're going down now, but they were did we change staff levels to accommodate the increase in complaints?
So just to kind of re-emphasise that the actual complaints at stage 1, so those initial complaints, they are investigated by the service area that they relate to. So for example, if it's a housing complaint, it would be investigated in that first instance by a housing manager. At stage 2, it's then investigated by customer services, and there is myself and James that investigate stage 2 complaints at that point. We haven't increased any staff numbers to accommodate that kind of increase in complaints in customer experience itself, but housing have now got some dedicated complaint handling roles just to acknowledge the fact that they have seen an increase in complaints, and they want to make sure that they are able to respond to those in a really timely manner, and of course provide those high levels of customer services that you were talking about there, and keeping that, you know, the tenant up to date as the complaint progresses. So in housing there has been some acknowledgement of the increase, and therefore staff have been recruited to kind of undertake those dedicated complaint roles, but not in customer experience itself, no.
Okay, thanks.
Is that? Okay, you'll come back to that.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. Thank you. First of all, what makes a complaint? So, for example, does it have to go through the portal? Or, for example, if a resident is complaining via their counsellor or in some other way, where it is clearly a complaint but they haven't gone through a procedure, does that get included in your figures? How, you know, would that be treated separately and not actually make it into your lineup of complaints?
Thank you for the question. So in terms of complaints, they can come in through various different channels. So people can telephone us and make a complaint. They can speak to us face-to-face at our customer access points and lodge a complaint through that means. If a resident writes to us as well, we will also then register the complaint if it comes to us through that means. And also they can log it directly through our complaint system online through our website. If councillors do receive complaints, if we are made aware of them, then we can log them on the complaint system. What we do tend to find is quite often a resident may have a complaint with us, and they may have also contacted their counsellor, so then we might be updating the counsellor and the resident through the complaints procedure at the same time, so almost twin tracking that process, if you will. But all of those complaints will be recorded where we know about them.
They kind of have to use the word complaint. I have a complaint. Or is it clear that they're annoyed or something's not going right, and then you think, oh, this is clearly a complaint. They might not have used the word complaint. I am making a complaint. You know, how would that be treated? You know, and clearly if it's coming through the counsellor, the word complaint might not have been used, but clearly things haven't been going according to the way it should be. So would that then be included, please?
Yes, so you definitely don't have to use the word complaint to have it registered as a formal complaint. We do have a standard definition of complaint, but each person will maybe express their dissatisfaction in different ways. So we will always try and deal with the inquiry in the best way for that particular resident. But no, they absolutely don't have to use the word complaint in order for it to be registered as such. We do actually see quite a high level of requests coming through to our complaint system as well, where it might be the first time someone's informed us that something, you know, that they want something to take place, if you will. But we would still respond to that customer even if we don't believe it's probably a formal complaint, because we still recognise that the resident has used the complaints process to register their concern. So we will always deal with each kind of case on its own merits, rather than kind of having hard and fast rules as to what a complaint would be.
And that would then be included in your figures as well?
Absolutely, yes.
Yep. And my second question, because that was all sort of part of one, if that's okay, was on page 38, there's a table where you're comparing it with the average, our figures with the average. Please, could you explain that to me? Because in most cases, it looks to me, if I've understood it correctly, that we're not doing terribly well. It's on my printed out version. It's on page 38, and it's preceded by a paragraph saying our complaints performance can be found under the section customer service. No, oh well. Yeah, we've included a table with the relevant complaint handling performance TSMs here. Is that any help? And so it starts CH01 bracket 1 number of stage 1 complaints received per 1,000 homes. Have you found that table? Thank you. Please could you explain that to me, because it looks to me, for example, in the first horizontal column, that the average, if I've understood it right, is 37, and you know we're way above that. So have I read it right?
Thanks, Councillor. So the table that you're referring to is showing the tenant satisfaction measures, which are the kind of housing satisfaction measures. You are absolutely right to read it in the way that we are currently not performing at the kind of average level for other landlords of our size. What I would say is, and you know, I'm conscious that this is a report for 23-24, and we are kind of now close to the kind of end of 24-25. So as we move into this year, you will start to see that our performance is vastly improving in this area. So we've already seen a 39% reduction in complaints over this last quarter in housing, and our tenant satisfaction measures are improving for this year. But of course, this is a look back over what the performance was then. So you are right to point it out that, you know, that's poor performance in terms of how many complaints we're receiving compared to other landlords. But we have been taking those steps to make improvements with our housing colleagues.
Councillor McCraw, you want to come in here?
Yeah, with the Chair's permission, if I could just add that that's one of the reasons why so much focus, so many reports have been given on housing satisfaction levels, our tenant satisfaction levels, in the course of the last year. As this data was being collated, we can see the table as well as you can. That's not good. That's why so much effort by Deborah Fenton's team across the board has been put in place. And as I say, the quarterly performance measures that you've seen in the reports of quarters 1 and quarters 2 this year definitely show that this table is no longer the case. It's certainly not satisfactory. You're quite right to point that out.
Thank you, Councillor. Is that Hatchett, please?
Thank you, Chair. My question is essentially an extension of sort of Catherine's, which is what constitutes a complaint. So I follow the Babergh Mid-Suffolk Facebook page, as I'm sure others do, and I'll quite often chip in. I think Miles quite often chips in, John Matheson does as well. So a lot of the comments in the comments section, so we'll post an article, and a lot of the comments in the comments section are essentially complaints. Do the communications team in Babergh Mid-Suffolk then contact these people and then say, would you like to make an official complaint? Or do they class them as an official complaint? Because I guess when I've been looking at the posts, the communications team, they do sort of chip in and reply, but I don't often see them post the link to the complaints sort of section of Mid-Suffolk. So I think, not that I want to get any more than 1,000 complaints, but I think if you started to include all of the Facebook comments and contacted those people, you might increase it. And then also an extension of that as well is, do we track things like East Anglian Daily Times? So when there's an article that perhaps relates to us, there's a comment section on that as well. I know it's hard to identify people, but a lot of the time there are pointed comments and complaints specifically about us, but it's in the comments section. So I guess my question is, do we reach out to people on these social media platforms and sort of request their feedback in form of complaint or feedback? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, so we do often reach out actually to residents directly where we're seeing that they are communicating on social media and perhaps they've obviously got concerns. Customer services actually respond directly to residents and will take complaints themselves, just so that the resident doesn't have to go online if they don't want to and then register a complaint. If they would just like to provide it to the customer services officer, they can do it that way. So we do accept complaints on social media, and it's actually part of our complaints policy that we will do as well. So if someone does want to log their complaint through that channel, they absolutely can do, and we will accept it. So some of the complaints that you will see reported do include people that will have raised those concerns through social media. In terms of tracking other news outlets, we don't do that because, as you say, it's really difficult to identify who those individuals are, and we can't actually accept anonymous complaints, so it would be difficult for us to actually respond directly. Sometimes, I have seen, for example, Google reviews that have kind of mentioned the council, and if it's quite specific, we can then check and see if that person has registered a complaint and just make sure that we are able to then communicate with them and resolve those issues, because that's the important thing, is being able to communicate with them and resolve the matter. And 9 times out of 10, those people already have kind of existing complaints with us that we're already responding to as well. But yes, in essence, they can, any resident can raise a complaint through social media as well.
Councillor McCraw.
If I could add, my experience in the portfolio, not with a formal complaint being made, there have been many occasions in the last few years where I've actually heard a whisper, a rumour of something, and I've asked Sam and other people to investigate to see what we can determine, see if we can find out what the source of the problem is, because sometimes you do hear things when you're out and about in your patch. If anybody lets me know something they've heard of that they think could be of concern, it's always possible for us to look into it and just to see whether it can be acted upon, even with limited information.
Answered your question, Councillor Patchett?
All good, thanks.
Yeah. Councillor Baker.
Thank you. Yes, on page 31, it references the risk management elements, and I'm quite surprised that there's only sort of one entry on there. So obviously, given that there's breaches and beyond the deadlines, I would have expected to see more lines to that risk management. Just wondering, so that's one thing just to sort of consider really, and sort of ask why they're not there. And the other one is on page 35, where you've got the classification of all the different types of complaints. I can see on asset management there's a -39, so there's a difference. So I'm wondering if there are some types of complaints that have been reclassified, or if there's a particular change. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, and I'll certainly take away your point around the risk management. The risk that was reported was specifically related to the report itself. all of the services, particularly housing and planning and areas where there are higher levels of complaints, they all have their own individual risks that they are managing through their service risk registers that are seen on our risk management system, Pentana. But what I can do, maybe moving forwards, is making sure that there's an overview of those on the annual report, so you can see kind of what's included for all of those different service areas. So happily take that away. Thank you for the feedback. In terms of the drop in the asset management complaints, you're absolutely right. There was a reclassification of the complaints. So where there's been quite a significant transformation in building services, different teams have kind of been established and their parameters have been made much clearer in terms of what kind of complaints are included for those areas. So it's more of a reclassification rather than anything that's particularly changed in that area. So yeah, thank you for flagging.
So, Councillor Baker. Councillor Jamieson.
Okay. Just a couple of things. I think I did see somewhere, I can't find it now, that when our contractors fail, we sometimes pay goodwill gesture payments. Do we do that? And if so, do we get the money back from our contractors for their failings?
So are we, in terms of, we do have to remedy a complaint to ensure that the tenant is not in a sort of disadvantageous position, if you will. So you have to put the person in the right position that they would have been in had the kind of error not have occurred, which means that we do have a compensation policy that we look to if there are if things have gone wrong and we believe that there is a sort of financial remedy that needs to be applied. And the Housing Ombudsman do ask that all local authorities who have kind of housing do have a sort of compensation policy as well. I wouldn't be able to answer off the top of my head, I'm afraid, whether or not we then recoup those costs from our contractors. I'd have to ask our housing teams as the people who would pay those kind of sums out. But I'd be more than happy to take that away and report to you outside of that, outside of this meeting, if that's okay.
Yes, fine.
Thank you.
And one other just before. On the plus side, I noticed there is quite a few compliments about the service our staff have provided. Do we reward staff if they go over and above their expectation of their work?
So we wouldn't necessarily, you know, as you know, we won't pay bonuses or anything in that kind of manner. But in customer services, we do have a kind of staff award of the month. So, for example, we do recognise if someone's received a high number of compliments, and we would. They kind of get a certificate and their name kind of on our board in the customer access point to recognise their achievements. Each service will do something slightly different, but all of the compliments are published to the manager of the officer that they relate to, and then the intention is that those managers pick them up within the individuals one-to-one to commend them for the compliment and the work that they did to achieve that.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor McCraw.
I'd like to add that there should be and is a lot of saying thank you. I know I do it myself. I think it's really important, and I'd like to put it on record, that there is a big thank you owed to our customer services team across the board, the phone work, the time taken to answer calls. I've done this elsewhere, but I think it's important to remember that there are real people doing this, and I actually think customer service is something of a vocation. There are some people who get it and some people who don't. And that applies to any service sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Page 52 refers to the Extending Fairness and the Vulnerability Project. There's quite a bit of information there about the way that council staff in housing and council tax deal with vulnerable persons. But it's my understanding that we don't actually have a formal vulnerable persons policy. Can you confirm that?
I can confirm that we don't currently have a kind of overarching vulnerable persons policy. It is something that we are working on with our colleagues as part of a kind of wider piece of work, and we look forward to explaining to councillors more about what that may look like over the coming months. But as you say, at this point in time, there isn't a kind of wider policy that relates to vulnerable people. What I would say is that actually it's really important in this first instance that we've been working on making sure everyone feels really confident, identifying what may need to be recorded around vulnerabilities. So both customer services and many of our housing colleagues have received external vulnerability training, as well as our shared revenues partnership colleagues as well. We have also got a vulnerability policy as part of our council tax kind of collection policies as well. So there are several strands of work, but as you can imagine, it's quite a large project, and it requires quite a significant sort of change across the whole organisation to bring people on that journey. So we will be looking to create a vulnerable policy, but it's not been published at this point, so you are right to point it out, but it is something that we are working on creating at this moment in time.
Question, yes.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I do really welcome that. I have had conversations with the housing portfolio holder on Mid-Suffolk about this subject, because I feel vulnerable people are perhaps the least likely to complain, whereas we should actually be encouraging them to complain, because their insight into how the council deals with them, I think, is really valuable. So I welcome that move, and possibly we recommend as a motion that we support the introduction of a vulnerable persons policy later on.
Sarah, have you made a note of that? Thank you. Councillor Grandin again.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I notice on page 39 it says that within public realm, just as an example, grass cutting is the biggest area of complaints, which I perfectly understand, because every summer and I'm sure all councillors, get complaints about grass cutting. But I wonder if this specific area, and there are probably other areas that are similar to this, the complaints could be vastly reduced if the councils communicated to the public about this grass cutting and if it applies to other areas. So the reason I'm saying this is, normally I would reply to the complainants in my ward and say, oh, you know, terribly sorry, I'll try and get it sorted for you. And then last summer, I dealt with it differently and asked, when's it going to be done? What's the cycle? And once I told the residents what the cycle was, so they knew when to expect the next one, they stopped complaining. I didn't get any more complaints that whole summer from those regular people who would normally spend every summer saying, oh, they haven't come again, and you know, the grass is getting... But once they knew that the cycle was this number of weeks, I think it was every 6 weeks or something, I can't quite remember now. So I'm thinking that if a press release or other communication channels could be put out at the beginning of summer in relation to grass cutting, and then you might think it applies to something else as well, you can manage people's expectations much better by saying, you know, this is how we do it, this year we'll be doing it this number of times, and you might apply it to other things too, you know, we'll be trimming the trees or whatever. It will actually stop or reduce the number of complaints in particular areas. You know, I'm sure there are other areas apart from grass cutting that it might apply to, where people then understand how we work. Might that be an idea, do you think?
Councillor Grandon, do you want to raise that as a recommendation later on that could be considered? So that, yeah. Councillor McCraw, I think you wanted...
On the subject of grass cutting, I mean, it's interesting. In both the time Councillor Grandon and myself have been on this council, the approach to grass cutting has changed. And in fact, the report makes deliberate reference to that. First thing to remember, of course, is that it's not just us that cut the grass. In fact, we cut the grass on behalf of Suffolk County Council. We cut it in collaboration with some parish councils and town councils. Grass cutting can take place in a variety of ways. So that first thing is just a practical problem and a bit scheduling. Over the years, there's been an increasing understanding that we need to have biodiversity and allow wildlife to flourish. And so when the grass is not cut, some people will complain it's not being cut, and some people are saying it's being cut too often, and they'd like it cut less often. So we have a little bit of disconnect in what people want out of their grass cutting service. That's why I think it tends to be treated as a service request rather than an actual complaint in some ways. The public realm, again, would be the people to speak to there. I think all these points can be made. As I say, I can see practical difficulties in publishing a schedule for something as site-specific as grass cutting. But I think we all know we're going to get requests from people to get a piece of grass cut in a particular place. It doesn't necessarily mean we'll be able to get that done within a given period of time, simply because the schedules and the people doing it are so varied. That's all I'm saying.
I think we've just got to be clear that the report in front of us is about the management of complaints. If we get into the specifics of a particular directorate, then I think we have got to consider. I'm just going to... Did you have another question?
No, I just wanted to say that I'm not just saying it only regarding grass. I was using that as an example of something that we can manage complaints.
Yes, Sam.
I think it's. I'm happy to still try and respond to the question. I think it's a really fair point, because ultimately the report does pull out some of those lessons learned, and we're always trying to think about how we can ensure that we're reducing complaints where there's kind of almost failure demand, if you will, rather than something's gone wrong. So we do try and publish some information about grounds maintenance on our website, but I certainly think it's something that could be, improved, and we can work with our public ground colleagues to look at that. Equally, perhaps for the next report, what I can do is look at where we've implemented communication campaigns as a result of some of those lessons learned from complaints, just so you can get a bit of a flavour as to some of the work that happens as a result of the complaints that we receive in terms of communication campaigns. So happy to take that one away for the next report. No worries.
I've still got a list. I'll put you on the end of it. Councillor Baker, you're the next one.
Thank you. Two other points. So feeding on what you've just sort of been mentioning, I wondered if you're able to add in the reports, and if you're able to collect the data around when the complaints come in, which ones have had councillor involvement. So I know sort of on behalf of most of us as councillors, if we have the communication come in to us and then we escalate it to the officers, we're very often able to intercept before they become complaints. I know many of us have dealt with particular issues in our areas, particularly around grass cutting, where we've been able to sort of broker that piece a little bit before they become a complaint. So I'd be interested to see that, if there's a councillor involvement and that kind of either way, whether it's positive or negative. And the other thing was around financials, if there's any possibility of having financials included in these types of reports. So the council doesn't really report on departmental costings. It doesn't really sort of say complaints department is costing this to operate in itself. We don't often see that. But I noticed on here on page 49, it's mentioning about a symbolic payment of £150. when things are kind of delayed and that sort of thing. If you're looking at, 200 and something cases were breached beyond, at what point are we paying out the £150 and what kind of value are we at? Each year, how much have we paid out in complimentary sort of £150 vouchers or £150 because we've breached our time? Does that make sense?
Yep, so I'm happy to come back on those points. So we don't currently have an easy way to probably report councillor involvement, but it's something, if you're happy, that I'll take away and look at how we might be able to do that moving forwards in terms of being able to see where there's been a councillor involvement. I would like to say we are incredibly grateful, though, where councillors are engaging with residents and, like you say, sometimes resolving that matter before it kind of escalates any further. So thank you very much for your support in that space. In terms of finances, I'm happy to include that in future reporting. What I would say is it tends to be predominantly for housing rather than the rest of the council in terms of those kind of compensation payments. The symbolic payment was an order from the local government ombudsman, which is why we paid that particular amount. We don't tend to see other compensation payments across other departments. So that would probably be a bit of a one-off, if you will, but certainly can take away a point around the housing compensation, because that's where it would predominantly relate to, if that's okay.
Councillor Rowe, you're next.
Yeah, got a couple of questions. One is very quick do you get the media roundup bulletin? Because us as councillors get that, and kind of thinking about kind of keeping track of comments. I know there's some of them will be anonymous, but some of them you might go, oh, that's someone's put their name in from previous complaints, you might be able to contact them. So yeah, do you get that, which we get from, I think, marketing? And we have the ombudsman, but is there any kind of external audit to kind of check that we're handling complaints as we should do? Because with the code, I think there's self-assessment and stuff, and obviously if people kind of have the capacity and drive, then it goes to ombudsman. But there will be some people who, for various reasons, just give up on complaints, but still might not be happy. And obviously with lots of other areas of council, there's kind of external audit. So yeah, is there any mechanism like that in complaints?
Yeah, so I'll just answer the first question. So in terms of the media kind of roundup, I don't receive those, but we do tend to keep an eye, as I say. Customer services do monitor the social media channels, so we feel that we'll try and keep in touch with residents through those kind of methods. As I've mentioned before, it is quite difficult to contact everyone who might leave a comment on any website. It would be really kind of difficult to maintain that. So that would be tricky for us. In terms of the kind of audit piece, we do have two ombudsmen, as you've rightly pointed out, and we did last year have an external audit as well undertaken by TIA, and that would have been reported into the audit committee. And it did find that in the main we were dealing with complaints well. They made a couple of recommendations around how we could change some of our complaint system so that we could more easily track when someone's contacted a resident within the 5 working days, because otherwise it was a manual check, so we weren't easily able to provide evidence to show every single 5-day contact, because it might have been a telephone call or something in that space. So when we implemented our complaint system, we did make those changes so that we can now audit those kind of complaint responses at the 5 days as well, as per the TIA audit recommendations. But otherwise they did do a sample check of all of our complaints and found that we were handling complaints well. So we do try and look for those opportunities to learn lessons ourselves in terms of the complaints procedure. The Housing Ombudsman also do check every self-assessment, so it's not just something we publish on the website and that's enough. They do check it, and they do actually let us know if they agree or if they find anything that's different to what we have published. So they have provided us in previous years some recommendations around some tweaks we could make to our complaints policy just to make sure it was in line with the changes of the Housing Ombudsman Code, which we did then change as a result. So they do check all of our self-assessments as well to make sure that we are saying what we're doing, if you will.
Councillor Caston.
Thank you very much, Chair. We have the stage 1 complaint that the department will deal with. Stop me if I've got this mixed up. So the department will deal with it, and I'd like to know, do you just leave it with them on that stage 1 complaint? Do you chase it up and make sure that we don't overrun deadlines? With the stage 2 complaint, is that working alongside the department? Because obviously you need all the information. It's much easier to do a stage 1 complaint, to handle it at stage 1 than stage 2, I should think. How that works, how you get that information, and also, are there any departments that you find it harder to get those complaints dealt with in the 10 days, or whatever you've allotted for it if you've asked for an extension, and are there other ones that work very well?
Okay, so thanks for the questions. So in terms of the 10 days and departments kind of complying with those 10 days, in the main, it's only when perhaps there's a more complex issue that we would expect that kind of timeline to kind of be extended. As the report notes that when housing experienced that much higher volume of complaints, we were seeing more complaints tripping over the kind of 10-day window, and that's why they took those steps as well to introduce additional complaint handling roles to reduce the amount of time it was taking to respond to those complaints. Waste services tend to respond to the complaints probably in the quickest manner, and that's just down to really the type of complaint. It's usually related to missed collections, which can be resolved quite quickly. Obviously, if you're dealing with a more complex complaint, it might be that more information is required and therefore it takes a bit longer to respond to. In terms of the was the other question around? Sorry, there was quite a lot of questions in there. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The working that you do during a stage 2 complaint, how you deal with that, where you get the information from, and how that works. I did ask about the worst offender. I don't know if it seems that asset compliance does take a long time, but you've kind of explained that already, because you've said it's far more complicated than, okay, we'll go and pick up the bin or whatever. But yeah, it's just how you work with the department on the stage 2 complaints, please.
Yes, apologies for that. So in terms of a stage 2 complaint, so when they come through, it's our role really not necessarily to kind of go back over old ground. What we'll do is consider the investigation that the department undertook and then ask supplementary questions, things that perhaps were missing from that initial stage 1 complaint. So we do absolutely have to work with the departments in order to get those answers, but what we're looking for is that evidence and the information to come to us so that we can review it independently. So we do have to work with services, but it's more about that they do have to provide us with what investigation they undertook at that initial phase for us to initially review, and then those additional questions we will then ask once we've been able to assess exactly what happened and what steps they took to investigate that complaint in the first instance. Because what we're looking for is making sure that they've covered all of the complainant's concerns, because sometimes it's a case of they've responded to most of the complaint, but there might be a couple of bits that they've just not quite understood, or they've missed the kind of full explanation on. So that's where we can come in and support the resident to get all of that information back from the department.
Could I have one more, please, Chair?
Yes, please do.
In the paper, I can't find it now, but it says somewhere that a resident can escalate a complaint at any point, I think it is. What's the reasoning behind that?
So a resident can escalate a complaint to the Housing Ombudsman at any stage, and that is because it's part of the Housing Ombudsman Code. So it's something that the Housing Ombudsman are really keen that if a resident doesn't feel that they're getting the response that they want at any stage within their process, they can then escalate it to the Housing Ombudsman. The Housing Ombudsman would work with us to understand what contact has already been made with that particular resident, and then usually they would try and ask the resident to go through our complaints process first. But if, for example, there was an instance where we hadn't engaged with the resident after a significant amount of time, they might take it rather than letting that person go through the complaints process. But we've not had that before. It's usually if someone's come too early to the Housing Ombudsman, they will just refer them back to us, and then we can support them to go through the complaints process. And then once they get their final response, if they're still unhappy, they can then go back to the Housing Ombudsman.
Councillor McCraw, you want to say something?
Yeah, if I may. On that last point, James, that was actually referred to in my preamble, is that there have been 5 instances where the Housing Ombudsman has upheld a complaint. But that's the situation. The reason I wanted to ask was that Councillor Rowe mentioned earlier about the media coverage and whether officers were looking at the media coverage. I look at the media coverage every day and every part of it, although I do have to note that it's often the same story by the same writer, reprinted in multiple outlets. And in fact, this very meeting received a report with a headline figure, which we all know, we all read it. We read it more than once. And I think that's an example of exactly that. If anything does refer to this portfolio, believe me, I and the other portfolio holders will each have a discussion with their own portfolio officers. That's how the directorate system works. It's a partnership, officers and councillors.
Is that okay? Answered your question? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. So I've got a question just where I need some sort of clarity, but I guess before that, just a half a reply to Catherine's sort of question about the pre-communication. I'm not sure about Babergh, but in mid-Suffolk, with regards to wilding and the grass cutting, in some village greens and open spaces, we put a little wooden board in that says, this area is being left to wild, and we're going to sort of do it from this month to this month. But it's not consistent, so that isn't across all villages and open spaces, that's just some. And I'm not sure why we do it on some open spaces and not others. And I know that isn't particularly a point for these guys, but obviously, Councillor Grandon, you sort of said we should do a pre-communication to save complaints, and most of the complaints I do get are actually about that. So I think perhaps Mid-Suffolk and Babergh need a consistent approach to this sort of wilding situation. If we're going to put a board in one open space, I think we should probably do it in all of them, really.
Councillor Patrick, can you raise that again in the debate so Alicia can make due note of that?
Sure.
But thank you for that comment.
And I guess, so my question for clarity is on page 35, figure 3, which is the breakdown of complaints by service. I guess now this is probably like my naivety of being a relatively new councillor, but I don't actually understand what all these headings are and actually what a complaint might look like in that area. So obviously I understand what a council tax complaint will be and a planning complaint. I'm not that bad, but sort of building services, asset compliance, tenancy service, housing solutions, strategic assets. I don't actually understand, and again this is probably more a problem with me, what does a complaint look like in those areas? What's a strategic asset complaint versus an asset compliance complaint? I don't actually understand. So if you, in layman's terms for me, because perhaps I'm a bit thick, just maybe explain to me what a complaint looks like, or an example of a complaint
I don't think I actually completely agree. I think we can certainly improve the headings for the next report, so thank you for that feedback. And usually it's something I would pick up on because I'm a big advocate for plain English, so I'm disappointed at myself for not picking up on that sooner, so thank you for that. In terms of the different headings, they just tend to be related. So building services, that's and I've put in brackets kind of the DLO, that's the kind of main day-to-day kind of repairs that we manage through. Okay, so do you know what I'll do? I wonder if it's perhaps, because I think I'm conscious that there's probably quite a few of these headings then. Would it be helpful if I took an action to plain English the headings and just put a description under each one as to what they might look like in terms of the types of complaints that come through? I can only apologise that I haven't done that in advance of this meeting. I think it's a very fair question. But just to make sure that there's no outstanding questions related to any of the headings, I will take that away as an action and make sure that the paper is amended to reflect that. Does that seem okay to?
I think that's a good idea,
Yeah.
Sam. Because I that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just glad it's not just me then, really. But I don't know whether you could quickly run through some of the ones and just sort of say, like, what actually where that area is. I don't get it.
Yep, so building services, asset compliance, they are part of Deborah Fenton's team. So Jane Branch would be the head of service. So it's that they tend to be around the kind of housing aspects and housing repairs. Tenancy services then is around things like antisocial behaviour. It will be things to do with sheltered schemes or your kind of general tenant experience, if you will, outside of housing repairs, because that would be your kind of building services and assets. Housing solutions, that's your kind of homelessness team, and also the process of getting onto the council home register, so the gateway to home choice process as it's otherwise known. Asset management is another part of, some of the teams within housing repairs have been split to recognise things like the damp and mould process and some of the actual assets that need to be managed. So homes are assets, aren't they? So thinking about some of the actual structural work that may be required in order to keep that home safe. And so the actual headings relate to who is really responding to the complaint rather than anything that's probably very helpful to you guys. So perhaps I can bunch those up together just so it feels clearer. So it's just housing repairs and then they all kind of come under there. In terms of strategic assets, that tends to relate more to some of the team that work in some of the new builds, and where the properties might be that there might be a sort of new build through MLA tax kind of area rather than them kind of being at that point part of the housing repairs kind of profile, if you will. I completely agree though. I think sometimes, and I will just be very open and honest, I think perhaps we can probably speak to service areas in the way that they want to see the complaints performance rather than thinking about how the public may perceive that. So apologies, and I will make sure that it is far more understandable moving forward. So thank you very much for that really valuable feedback. I hope I've given you a slight whistle-stop tour of some of those headings just for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam, for that. Councillor Grandin, you're...
Thank you. I might have missed this. On page 44, you're talking about the survey of 81% of properties at the time of writing the paper. Can you confirm that that's been completed and as near to 100% has been done as possible now, please?
So I can confirm that Housing have attempted now 95% of all of the surveys. I understand that there are some residents who do not wish for the survey to be undertaken, so it's going to be re-explored this year, if you will. So people will be asked if they want to now partake in that survey. So it might be that there's been no entry provided when someone's gone to survey the property, so they'll be re-attempted over this year.
Thank you. And then my other question is, I'm not quite sure how to put this very well and to make myself clear, but there seems to be a lot of discussion on the complaint and the recording of it and that kind of thing. And not so much, but I have seen examples where there have been good examples, but of solving the situation that the person is complaining about, if you see what I mean. Finding a solution. So I see, for example, I've lost it now, where there have been some examples where you've said, and we have now done this as a result of the complaint, and I can't find my page now where I found a good example of it. But it seems to me almost more of these are the complaints, this is how we record it, but there hasn't been enough trying to find solutions to why that complaint was made in the first place. Please, could you say whether I'm being fair on that or not, please?
Thanks, Councillor. So we have tried to put some of the high-level kind of trends and what we've done about some of those kind of wider improvements. I don't want to say if you're right or wrong. I think that's absolutely fine. If that's how you feel, then I can certainly have a look at the paper moving forwards and see how for the next year's performance report we can maybe build in some case studies. I think it's very difficult, isn't it? Because without disclosing things that are quite personal to someone within their complaints process, you don't want to identify someone by saying this is the exact measures we took to remedy those complaints. Of course, each complaint will have a remedy because that's the nature of complaints. We want to make sure that the person has that complaint resolved, and that's usually a remedy. But I can certainly have a look at whether or not we could just flesh out some case studies to support with bringing that to life a bit more.
Yeah, sort of a learning process type thing. And perhaps that's where I got the examples of where you have provided such information, where towards the end of the paper you've given some escalated complaints, and then you've said what you did. So maybe that's what we need perhaps a little bit more of. Thank you.
Councillor McGraw.
Thank you, Chair. In fact, on that very point, if I might, Councillor Grandon, the bottom of page 52, I think covers the area you're discussing. It's about complaints training, it's about lessons learnt, because let's face it, we don't want to be having to repeat the problem, because that's going to only lead to more problems. So there is, I hope that will provide you the answer. Managing our compliance. Well, we have compliance requirements within our complaint system. That's what we're looking to do. And I think there's also an Institute of Customer Service benchmarking survey taking place so that we can actually measure ourselves against other providers in a fair, obviously, comparison.
Thanks. Just a couple of things. Each week we get emails from John Mosley at Planning with details of planning applications in our areas, new planning enforcement cases. I wonder, is there something, could we do that with complaints? Is that something we could do so that you get emails?
If I might, theoretically, but obviously bear in mind, in many cases, complaints are very personal, whereas planning applications are rather less. They're a public domain feature. So when you're looking at a particular site or a particular planning application or an enforcement case, that's something that's impersonal. When you're dealing with some other things, I suppose in theory, I think it could be explored.
If it's not in detail, if you know you've got a lot of complaints in such and such road in your area or repeat complaints, it might be...
Perhaps Sam could comment on this. I have some issues. I think it could be problematic at least.
So we have changed our complaint system to actually be able to record more about where the complaints are coming from, because previously we didn't necessarily need someone's address in order for them to log a complaint. So we are able to now understand more at the location in which someone is complaining. I think what I'd probably want to do though is take that away to see how we would do that in a really data secure way, to make sure that it was providing that the complainant with their opportunity though to remain kind of confidential in terms of the complaint that they're raising, but also making sure that it's something that we could deliver in a timely way, because it would likely be a manual process of us kind of looking at complaints per location, if you will, and then telling you about how many. So I'd probably just want to explore that a bit further to see how that might be useful and what specifically would be useful for you as councillors to see about complaints that relate to your particular areas. So if it's okay, I'll take that away and come back to you separately. Thank you.
And one last thing. Is it possible for a resident to check on the progress of their complaint when they've logged it online, or is that feasible, or is, I mean, it'd probably be expensive. I wasn't sure if it was feasible.
So they can see when the complaint is kind of being processed and then when they get the response. We do, because we communicate with our residents at that 5-day point and then the response is issued within 10 days, the dates as to when you'll get the next response are clearly articulated, so we don't necessarily think that a kind of live tracker would kind of offer any real benefit, because ultimately a lot of the work that's happening outside of the system is that kind of investigation, and you're having to go and kind of speak to other parties or look at what's happened in order to understand more of the details around the case. But hopefully the system at least shows you that the kind of complaint's been accepted, and then when it's being processed, if more information is also required, you'll get an email to say, could you provide us with some more information, and then it will come back and say information has been received. So there's small updates that you'll see on the system, but it doesn't kind of tell you kind of piece by piece exactly what the officer is doing. But I hope that with the clear deadlines that we set around complaints, that gives our residents enough reassurance as to where they are in that complaints process.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Wyman.
Thank you, Chair. First, I'd like to express my gratitude, and the report is really clear. I won't be expressing any dissatisfaction at the quality of the report because it's clear. Councillor McCraw alluded in his preamble to the sort of, I won't call it the complaints culture, but we've seen a massive increase in complaints and the approach to complaining over the last 30 years, which is to some extent part of society. But what I would say is that we use the word complaint, and I will get to a question, Chair. We use the word complaint when we should probably say contact or something, which, you know, why do we have to say complaint? We talk about compliments, you know, let's say talk about contacts. What my real question is, and it sits around something that Councillor Grandin said and also Councillor Patchett, is that we have this great analysis of contacts. What I'd like to see a little bit more of really is the responsiveness of the various departments within the council, because I'm measured, or we're measured, on how we respond to these things really. That's what the quantitative metric is. We're great at recording it, but it would be really useful to understand how responsive we are to these issues. And I suspect, you know, obviously some complaints are complicated and some are easy. That, you know, you made the point about the waste and things. We have a great waste team and they do really well. They respond themselves to people's issues of dissatisfaction. But I'm concerned that some of the more in-depth issues and deeper issues that people do complain about don't perhaps get responded to as quickly as we might like. And the point Catherine made about us understanding that, because I'm not sure I would understand if someone said to me, well, you know, what's the theme of dissatisfaction in Cable St Mary? I'm not really sure what it is. What I do know what it was in the spring of last year, which was grass mowing. And, you know, I've got the usual dichotomy of people who want it like that and the people who want it like that. So, you know, I mean, but you can't solve those problems. Those are insoluble problems. So I think it'd be useful to understand what the response is within the council and the departments, and how we can actually make sure that we understand that as a group, because that's how we're measured by our council taxpayers. What point I was going to make was James's point about the change in the structure of the table, where you've got buildings and assets, etc. You can quite easily just drop those into areas of responsibility.
Yeah, I'm happy to make those changes, but in terms of how responsive we are, for complaints we do record how quickly people respond to the complaints, and we have detailed those in the report. As I mentioned, some areas where there's been higher levels of demand, we have seen some difficulties in responding to those complaints in a really timely manner. But in the main, I would say that complaints and comments are responded to within those 10 working days, unless otherwise agreed with the resident. I think that the kind of broader point you're making, though, is around general contact with our residents. So perhaps not necessarily for this report, because we do have to have some of these headings included as part of our statutory kind of reporting to the Housing Ombudsman. But what I can do is look to perhaps provide a bit more of a summary around general contact into the councils, how that comes in, sort of online methods, and it's difficult for us to say exactly how quickly all of our contact is responded to, but we can try and get some kind of reassurance around contact, for example, and generally how quickly it's responded to for those different areas.
That's fine. So I get that, and it's all about context, isn't it? I mean, I have an expectation that I will get beaten around the head by mowing, etc., in the springtime. If the season's bad, I expect it. But the context of the things which are more significant to, say, me as a councillor for Cape St Mirror or whatever, that's what really is important, I think, for everyone, but also for this committee to understand how, as a unit, the authority responds to these points.
And I certainly take on board the point around how we could maybe display some themes as part of the kind of wider performance reporting that could be useful for you in your area, so you kind of understand more about the trends related to your particular sort of geographical locations. So I'll take that away as part of the wider point around reporting.
I accept that this is probably taking you beyond what I can see Alistair nodding, beyond what you would expect to do, but nevertheless I still think it's an important part of our role to understand what our contact is with the wider members of the public and our council taxpayers.
Councillor McCraw.
I would just add that I would take this sort of annual report, which is in abeyance by a year, in conjunction with the much more up-to-date quarterly performance reports, which are regularly publicised and debated in Cabinet and are available to watch online when we're in the room here, for example. But those quarterly reports are always available, and you can actually, if you notice recently, you will be able to see the trend, because in our current performance management presentation, you're going to see 4 quarters. So you're going to have a picture of how things went over the course of the last year, and I think that will be very useful.
I'm going to two things I would like to raise with you, Sam. One is I would have liked to have seen an explanation around the democratic services complaints. It was difficult to, and perhaps that's not your remit, but you did explain some of the other areas in that table. But I would have liked to have seen an explanation around the democratic services complaints. I know there wasn't many, but they're important, aren't they? So if that could be fed back to us, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. And the other thing was, I think I spoke to you about before the meeting, it would be helpful recognising that this is a public meeting and the public may read the reports, some sort of process on how a practical explanation of what happens when a complaint comes into the council, be it on telephone or online. Would that be possible in a future report?
Thanks for the question. So in terms of the process, I'm more than happy to make something a bit more visual. I think we discussed the fact that the complaints policy does set out what happens to complaints, but I think some people would prefer to see that in more of a process kind of map, if you will. So more than happy to produce something that feels a bit more visually pleasing, and we can implement that into the complaints policy. That's absolutely no problem. In terms of democratic services, quite often the complaints that are coming in for democratic services are actually needing to be rerouted through the code of conduct process, which is then reported separately outside of the kind of annual complaints report, because that is dealt with separately. Yeah. But that tends to be the complaints that are coming through. They're coming through the formal complaints procedure because someone perhaps hasn't understood where they're meant to go. But we still report them because it's important that we've done that kind of warm handover then to a kind of code of conduct complaint.
Well, I think we've given the team a lot of questions. I want to just stop for the time being and have a break before we go into debate. I think everybody's ready for it's 11 o'clock, so I think we'll just have a comfort break. But first of all, I would like to thank you and Sam and James and Alistair and Sarah for a good presentation, excellent report. I think we all found it fascinating, and we look forward to, and being the first one, that was a lot of hard work went into that, and so we look forward to subsequent reports. So thank you very much. But we'll have a 10-minute break and then we'll come back for debate. Thank you very much, committee. Welcome back, committee, and we are now going to open the item for debate. So who is going to open the debate for me? Councillor Scarf, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, may I first of all say I think it was a really informative report, and I like the fact that we are increasing our openness as to councils to enable complaints to be made more easily. And to counter the press argument the other day, which we talked about earlier, yes, there are a large number of increases in complaints, but also in this paper it also tells us there's quite a good increase in compliments too, which is 10%. No one said anything about that yet, so I think that needs to go on record. And I thought there were some interesting analogies, because housing creates the most complaints, and I suppose we would expect that, but housing has also created the most compliments. Bit of a dilemma, really. But yes, I welcome the report. I think it was very good. I think as we move forward, it will get better. I would like to talk about the recommendation that I mentioned earlier. I think we should have a vulnerable persons policy. It's something I've sort of championed for quite a while now. So I'm really pleased that we're moving towards that. But I think if the committee could formally endorse that approach, I think that would help with this, because I think how we deal with vulnerable people is incredibly important, but even more important when it's a complaint, because I don't think they're more likely to make a complaint. In fact, they're less likely to make a complaint, and we won't learn the lessons that we're trying to learn.
Thank you, Councillor Scarf.
Yeah, it was a really good report and quite interesting to go through. One thing which I noticed kind of wasn't in here was the number of unique complainants. So you have the number of complaints, but not necessarily how many people have complained. And kind of there's a couple of different elements that, so I'd recommend we include that, and then in the narrative have a bit of an explanation about what's driving the number of people, because sometimes you have people who kind of have lots of complaints because they just are a complaining type, basically. But you also have other examples where when we had the building services stuff not being sorted, there may have been like individuals who were having to complain regularly, and that could be drawn out a bit in the narrative. So yeah, I'd recommend we have unique complaints and then narrative about what is driving that in future reports.
Thank you. Yeah, totally agree. It's a good report. There's a few bits in here I think we've got to take notice of. I know the portfolio holders said that it's actually got a lot better since then, but as a scrutiny committee, I think we've still got to look at this as it is, and we've got, the complaints have gone up, we've got quite low percentages of complaints making it with the time scales, and an increase in escalations. So I think as a scrutiny committee, it seems to me that when we look at these complaints, we've got to look at complaints individually, because obviously when there's complaints about how people are banded in the gateway, which is obviously a complaint and it's disappointing, but if their application's how it should be, there's no way we can change that. We've got antisocial behaviour complaints and things like that that we do work really hard on, but it's not at the fault of the council. They should be treated quite differently to things like we've not had a boiler for a month or something and it's cold and everything like that. So what I was looking at with this is if we could look into, when we look at something in scrutiny, that a certain department, that we have a list of each individual complaint on that department. Like for instance, when we're looking at housing, we have the housing complaints that we can go through. We can decide for ourselves, like, exactly which ones we think reflect issues within the service and which ones don't. So I just wonder how hard it would be when, say, we look at housing, for instance, to have in that scrutiny document a list of the complaints and how many are upheld, because it is really important how many of these complaints are upheld. It's important how many complaints you have within a department, but it is so important how many are upheld, and we've got very few upheld complaints in here, considering what we've got. So I think we've got a few sort of recommendations coming out of this, but I think I'd like to look into attaching that onto scrutiny items, please.
Councillor Jameson.
Thank you, Chair. First, I'd like to commend Sam and the team on both the report and the work they're doing. They're obviously doing a lot of good work in this area. I mean, companies, as Councillor McCraw said initially, companies are not really judged on the number of complaints you get. Complaints are not really a bad thing. What companies are judged on is how they deal with complaints. And if you, I mean, as I said earlier, I worked in customer relations previously, and if you can turn around a screamer when you get them on the phone or when you get the complaint into someone who is happy, that makes such a difference for the customer, for the resident, and they can turn from someone who hates you to someone who is so you know, the work we do, if we can do that, that will make a big difference to our residents. And I think it seems like certainly Sam and the team have got that attitude, so that's nice to hear. As I said earlier, I think it would be nice if, data protection allowing, if we could see how many complaints we have in our area. I mean, obviously, as was alluded to, there might be areas, things they can't tell us because of, but we could also be involved in helping correct some of those, and we may know residents more than some of the officers do. As Councillor Rose said, some of them are serial complainers, and you may know these people and what they're like. So perhaps sometimes working with the local member may be able to help the officers in some respects. So if we know what complaints we have in area, like we do with planning, again, as I said, data protection allowing that information, I think that would be good. So, yeah, perhaps. Yeah, thanks.
Councillor Patchett.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you to Sam and the team for compiling the report, and sort of Alistair for coming here. And I'm sure it's not easy dealing with complaints, so thank you for the job that you do. Obviously, we live in Britain, and we like a good moan. I don't, you know, if we were sat here with 200,000 people and we had anything less than 1,000 complaints, I don't actually think I would believe it. You know, even in a perfect world, doing a perfect job, you'll still get a lot of complaints. I complain a lot. Anyone who lives with me will tell you that. I think a lot of this is, you know, causation versus correlation. It's like, what's the root cause of these complaints? And I think we've only really got on page 52 the one sort of paragraph about the lessons learnt. And to me, this is almost the most actually important paragraph, because it's like, so we got the complaint, so what are we going to do about it? So I guess I would like to know a bit more about the sort of the lessons learnt groups. Again, in a previous life, I was an occurrence investigator for sort of military aviation issues. And even when you had a failure of a component, like a piece of metal snapping, it's never about that piece of metal snapping. It's very, very rare that you would aircraft fall out the sky because of like a problem with a component. You can always trace it back. It's very rarely a defect in manufacturing. It's about human factors, about the person that installed it, quite often, and it's also then prior to that, it's actually about policy. I guarantee you a huge percentage of our complaints are from a problem. It's not about the grass that's growing that people don't like. It's about the communication that people didn't get about why we were doing the grass. And I think you can aim off a lot of complaints with good communication and good policy change. So I think what is really important and what I would like to know more about is actually these groups. Who attends it? You know, is there someone from risk? Is there someone from policy? Are the heads of department there? And how do they implement a change in the policy or education and training to the staff so that this problem never actually occurs in the first place? You know, that's always the best route to take, is always to actually stop the thing happening in the first place, not just dealing with the complaint, but actually stop it from happening. So I think going forward, I would sort of like to know a bit more about the lessons learned groups and sort of policy change. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention about the training aspect for the staff. So within Suffolk County Council, there was a period where they did some significant training. So all the staff understood complaints, concerns, inquiries, complements, the process, how the timelines, all that sort of thing. I think that we might be a little bit behind in district with that possibly. And I wonder if perhaps working with Suffolk County to look at how they've managed that and whether there could be sort of some work brought into district to do that, because I think when the staff have inquiries come in, if they have a concern that's raised or if it's an official complaint, I don't know that it's always being logged as such. We see quite a lot as councillors, we see a lot of communications, and we're not sure that many of them actually get registered as a complaint when actually they probably should. So I'm just thinking about the training for the staff. That's really...
We're going out of order, Councillor Baker, but I am just going to refer your statement back to Sam, because I think they are responsible or part of the training of staff. I think she needs to answer that for us. Okay? Thank you.
Yep, thanks for that. So we do undertake induction training with all staff to look at just general customer services and complaints and inquiries and things are discussed as part of that. We have also, we do provide complaints handling training to anyone who may respond to a complaint as well, so that people feel confident knowing how to respond to a complaint. And we do also have an intranet site that gives some lessons learned around how you can respond to complaints. It shows templates and how to, and it also shares all of the spotlight reports from our ombudsman. And we did also pay in the last year for the local government ombudsman to deliver training to over 70 staff in how to handle complaints and inquiries effectively. But more than happy to speak to colleagues in county and see what else they're doing and see how we can also share best practice with them as well. More than happy to.
Thank you, Sam. That was helpful. I think it's quite easy for us to sort of make judgments, isn't it? But we need to know what's actually happening. Any more comments? Councillor Wyman.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I don't think I can improve on the eloquence of my colleagues with the various points that have been put forward. I do think the real, as James mentioned, the causation is a really big issue. We need to focus on causation, and we need to focus on what the results we can create from the causation and the responsiveness of the various departments across the authority. Other than that, great report, fantastic. We must record all our complaints extremely well, or contacts.
Are we ready to go to recommendations? I'm going to actually start off what I would like to see in the recommendations. We have been given the opportunity to have a look at these complaints, and What we avoided this morning was actually looking at the specific departments that have complaints, because that would have detracted from the report that Sam was presenting to us, so we avoided that. But there are two departments that I would like Overview and Scrutiny to do a deeper dive into the complaints management, and that is housing and planning. And I would like that to go forward as a recommendation. Happy to take any more recommendations. Councillor Scarf, you've got your recommendation, haven't you? Do you want to speak to that again?
It's just, we were talking about vulnerable people and the fact that we didn't have a vulnerable persons policy, although we are instituting training to identify vulnerable people. So it was just an endorsement of the process that apparently is now underway to adopt a vulnerable persons policy and the benefits it can have, particularly regarding this area.
I don't necessarily disagree with you about planning, but I'm a bit surprised that you said about planning, because on this sheet there's no change, no, you know, they're not high up in the list for complaints, and they haven't had an increase in complaints. So I'm just concerned about the justification for that department being chosen. But, you know, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but it just seems, according to the table, it seems hard to justify picking that department out.
I think it is worth looking at planning and seeing how they manage complaints.
Okay. And on the other point, we had said that my suggestion of preempting complaints by communicating things like grass cutting schedules and other areas that can be preempted or communicated, that should be examined and communicated where appropriate. So if that could be one of the recommendations, please, if everyone is in agreement.
Councillor Patchett.
Thank you, Chair. Just, I guess one for Alistair. So when they do the lessons learned groups and boards, do yourself and Andy Mellon sort of sit on that as well as part of that?
So fundamentally, as portfolio holders, we're not going to be trying to micromanage officers doing their jobs. That's not our role. Our role is to deal with the overarching policy, the general drive, and make sure that officers have the resources they need. As I say, I'm not a big one for micromanaging, going down to every level. When I'm in my own ward role, then obviously I can do that on an individual complaint, but it's a very risky idea, I think, for a portfolio holder to try and be involved in the minutiae. That is what officers are for, because they actually have the professional training. And I've always said I've described us as gifted amateurs at best.
I guess but it does say on sort of page 52, it does say that when you're having these lessons learnt, there sometimes needs to be a change of policy. So if you're looking at the overarching policy, but the policy needs to be changed, do you not need to be in the room to assist with that overarching change of policy?
Absolutely we are, because that's when, for example, various documents have been brought before the council describing our policy changes and also our action plans. So that's a different process from the day-to-day detail of the nitty-gritty, if you like, the sharp end. So we have and will be continued to be. For example, mention was made of the risk assessment and how we measure risk. Now, the risk register is immense, and then there is a risk appetite. And all these exist in documents, in forms, and those we are very much involved in. That's our function, really. But in terms of, so for example, I would not, despite the fact that I'm a trained customer service provider and have actually provided customer service training to my own staff, and I've also got experience in call centres, I would not dream of going onto the phones in our call centre in Stowmarket without a great deal of training. And in fact, I don't think it's a good idea to do that. There's a separate function here.
I'm now going to ask the Democratic Services Officer to if there's no more recommendations. Alicia, would you like to read those out for us so we can peruse them? Thank you.
Of course, thank you, Chair. So I have 6 recommendations for the committee based on questions and debate this morning. I'll go through them one by one. Recommendation 1 is that the Joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee receives an annual complaints performance report as per the new Housing Ombudsman Complaint Code. Recommendation 2, that officers take on board the committee's suggestions about additions to future reports, including clearer language, an illustrative complaint handling process map, lessons learned, and the number of unique complainants. Recommendation 3, that the Joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee supports the introduction of a vulnerable persons policy. Recommendation 4, that the Joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee conducts a further in-depth review into complaints received by Housing and Planning at a future meeting. Recommendation 5, that the Head of Customer Experience explores introducing more training for officers to assist with undertaking investigations into complaints. And recommendation 6, that the Communications Department explores using pre-communication as a means of potentially reducing the number of complaints. Thank you, Chair.
Committee, any comments on that? Everybody support those? Councillor Scarr, if you look, no, you're happy with that. Councillor Rowe?
Did we, in the point about what we want to see in future reports, was there a bit about amount resolved or something? Because there's a bit of discussion about resolution figures as well as the complaints, I think.
So, thank you, Councillor. I'm happy for that to be captured by recommendation 1.2 that the officers take on board the committee suggestions. I think Sam and James have heard that and will include that in future reports. So I think, yeah, we should expect to see that in the future. Thank you.
Is that right, Councillor Rowe?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. I will now ask the lead officer to conduct the electronic vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Members, that vote is now open in ModGov. You may have to scroll down in your app to see it. Thank you. That's fine. Do you want me to take your vote verbally? Cool. Thank you. Councillor Grandin, can I take your vote verbally, please? Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. That makes 9 votes for the recommendation, so that is unanimous.
Thank you. So, can I now move on in the agenda, please, to item 10, the forthcoming decisions list. Do members have any comments? No? So the forthcoming decisions list is for noting. Item 11, this is the Overview and Scrutiny Action Tracker. Do members have any comments? Councillor Rowe.
I'm just looking at the bit about the Cabinet gives consideration to priorities within capital programme and explores bringing forward projects such as shelfware deliverable. I think I've seen emails where I'd say that might be ongoing, because I know there have been discussions around budget and stuff about capacity and stuff. So yeah, I think that could be updated possibly to ongoing rather than not started.
I appreciate that update. Thank you, Councillor Rowe. I'll get that amended on the action tracker for the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This refers just to Mid-Suffolk. The Greenhouse Gas and Carbon Reduction Management Plan, when we did that session, recommendation 1.8 was that the Cabinet considers building a ring-fenced climate reserve, a sufficient amount that covers the Council's decarbonisation projects and enables the Council to react to new government grants and match fund these when appropriate. And that hasn't been started, but I would have hoped that we might actually have had it in time for the budget, because we are repurposing a number of reserves within Mid-Suffolk over specific areas. So I wonder if perhaps the Scrutiny Officer could chase that, because I think that is something that could be achieved. It's just a matter of moving money from one reserve to another, but it does make that commitment then to actually, delivering what we want. So I'm just a little bit concerned that that hadn't been started, bearing in mind we're in the middle of the budget process already.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Scarf. I'll talk to Councillor Mellon about that and see if we can get an update. Thank you.
It's just a general point. I think it's been discussed before. It's very difficult to sort of gauge timelines with this stuff, and I know it's difficult to have deadlines and things, but even if it's within the year, even, whether we could consider putting them in some kind of order or priority rating, or schedule them, or get some dates somehow.
Lucy, do you want to answer that?
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Of course, it's something that we can look at going forward. In terms of recommendations, we do try to date them when we're making the recommendations, so give them a deadline, but sometimes it's just not feasible to put a deadline on something. We can explore sort of the prioritisation of actions within the action tracker going forward. Obviously, the stuff that happened many months ago is stuff that we really do want to push and see settled now. And there's also recommendations in there, such as the one that Councillor Scarf just brought up, which is quite tied into the budget, so needs to really be pushed now. So it's something that we can look at, and I'll explore with the chairs going forward. Thank you.
Yes, I was going to say, any more comments on the action tracker? So the action tracker is for noting. Now, item 12, which is for Babergh only. Do Babergh members have any comments on the overview and scrutiny work plan? Councillor Wyman.
Just an observation, Chair, really. Our car parking has gone live today, charges across the car park. So I suspect by July time, it might not be a bad idea to get some feedback from our public realm colleagues over how it's bedding in, what the expectations are, how people feel, is it working for us, are we getting the right revenues, etc. From that process. I'm surprised Councillor Grandin didn't bring that up.
Thank you, Councillor Wyman. Of course, I'll talk to the Director of Operations about potentially bringing something back. I'm sure.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we've got nothing on the agenda for the 17th of February or the 14th of April. Now, normally that would be the chairs and vice chairs to sort of have a discussion and try and get a report forward and so on. But There is one area, I think, where we could possibly bring a report for the April meeting, certainly. We expressed an interest in locality grants and funding. There is some movement on that in Mid-Suffolk at the moment, but that doesn't stop us still doing the review, because I think we need to look at what the outcome of the change in the grant structure was for Mid-Suffolk, because there have been some significant changes, and also into the remit of what locality grants would cover. I'm not talking about the budget element allocated to members, but I think we should try and populate that as possible. So I wonder if we could have that as the subject for the 14th of April, because I never like to see blank times, dates in the forward plan.
Councillor Scarf, of course, April was when I was potentially thinking of doing that item as well, so that works out. But we'll probably discuss at the chair's briefing next week about fleshing that item out, and then I'll approach the current Director of Communities and the Manager for Grants about putting together a report, hopefully for April. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I was just saying there's so much coming up for chairs and vice chairs. I would like to see us and James that we meet here in person and we have a strategy meeting, if that's acceptable. Thank you. That concludes the meeting, and I want to thank everybody for your support today. Again, thanks to the team, the community services team, and just thank you for contributing. I think we've had a very good meeting, and that is the end of the meeting for today. And the next one is on the 17th of March. Thank you.